One moment, I was simply watching the hole for our new swimming pool being dug. The next, a total stranger appeared on my property, filming me like I was the final boss in a home renovation scandal. She yelled that I was destroying community values and called the police on the spot because apparently, building a pool on 15,000 acres of open ranch land now qualifies as a felony in her eyes. Honestly, I couldn't decide what was more amusing, her outrage, or the fact that she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Ever had one of those self-appointed HOA crusaders come barging into your life uninvited? Tell me what state you're tuning in from, because misplaced authority sure likes to travel. The morning had started off peacefully. I stood next to the half-dug pool, watching the excavator carefully shape the deep end while my horses grazed in the distance. The dry needle basin stretched out around me, 15,000 acres of pure Montana beauty that had belonged to the Lindell family for over 100 years. My great-grandfather claimed this land back when Montana was still wild country, and we've been its stewards ever since. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. I was thinking about how my kids would love splashing in this pool come summer when I heard the telltale hum of an expensive engine fighting its way up our dirt road. A spotless white BMW pulled in, instantly coated in dust. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd just walked out of a corporate office and wandered miles off course. Her perfectly styled bob looked like it had been chiseled from marble, and she held her phone like it was some sort of weapon. Before I could say a word, she marched toward me with the confidence of someone who's never been told no in their life. "Excuse me, you need to stop this construction immediately," she said, flashing her phone and tapping the screen. She was recording and no doubt trying to capture what she thought was some kind of crime scene. "This swimming pool is a complete violation of our community standards," she snapped. I calmly set down my coffee mug and faced her properly, keeping my tone level. "Good morning to you too, ma'am. I'm Bolindell, and this is my ranch." "Not sure what a community you mean, but this is private land. I've been in my family for generations." She rolled her eyes dramatically, like I was some clueless fool who didn't understand the rules of civilization. "I'm Ramon Ickley, president of the Dry Needle Hills Homeowners Association. We have aesthetic compliance authority over this entire region," she said, gesturing broadly like she was giving a TED talk to an imaginary crowd. "Your little project here is ruining the natural beauty that our residents pay a premium to enjoy." I couldn't help but laugh, not out of disrespect, but because the entire situation was starting to feel like a sketch comedy. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this ranch was here long before any HOA ever existed. My family's owned this land since 1923. Pretty sure your association doesn't apply here." But Ramona wasn't backing down. She marched closer to the excavation site, likely angling for a better camera shot. "Jurisdiction is exactly the issue here," she said. "The HOA has full authority to enforce community standards across this valley, and this monstrosity is unacceptable." She gestured wildly at the pool construction, which, in reality, was just a hole in the ground soon to be filled with water and laughter. Getting more theatrical by the second, she stepped backward, trying to frame a dramatic wide shot of the destruction. What she didn't notice was that she was stepping straight into the path of the excavator, which was still in motion and had just lifted a full scoop of muddy dirt. The operator, bless him, was waving her away, clearly trying to warn her, but she was too caught up in her grandstanding to notice. "This is the kind of selfish behavior that drives down property values," she declared just as the excavator swung its bucket and dumped its load. A spray of mud and dirt flew through the air, hitting her squarely and transforming her from polished executive to abstract art in under 2 seconds. Her expression was priceless, frozen in disbelief as mud dripped from her perfectly coiffed hair and her designer outfit turned from pink to brown. Even her phone screen was splattered, giving her unsuspecting viewers quite a show. "You did that on purpose," she gasped, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. I raised my hands in mock surrender. "Ma'am, no one made you walk behind heavy equipment. That's just basic job site safety." The excavator operator was visibly struggling not to laugh. I had to fight back a grin myself. There's something poetic about watching someone get a face full of reality when they're trying to control things they have no claim to. Her shock turned to fury in an instant. She pointed a muddy finger at me and shouted, "This isn't over. I'm calling the authorities. They're going to shut all this down." She stormed off toward her car, leaving behind a trail of muddy footprints and muttering angrily about permits and violations. Before getting into her BMW, she spun around one last time and barked, "Police will be here to arrest you." I waved cheerfully. "I'll be right here waiting, ma'am. Have yourself a lovely day." As her car disappeared down the dusty road, I couldn't help but wonder just how far she was going to take this. She had no idea who she'd just picked a fight with. A couple hours later, I got my answer. While I was inside pouring another cup of coffee, Ramona was busy dialing 911, her voice laced with righteous fury. "There's a man here doing unauthorized construction, violating multiple codes and endangering community safety. I need officers sent immediately." The dispatcher, ever professional, promised someone would be sent out. What Ramona didn't realize was that the officer assigned to respond to the complaint turned out to be none other than Deputy Gideon Ta, who had been working under my supervision for the past 4 years. When he saw the address come through on the dispatch screen, he instantly recognized it as his boss's ranch. I could only imagine the look on his face as he scrolled through the complaint: unauthorized construction, code violations, and threats to public safety, all allegedly taking place at the home of the county sheriff. He gave me a call before heading out, and I could hear the amusement in his voice as he tried to hold back laughter. "Boss, I've got a complaint filed against you," he said. "Some lady's claiming you're running an illegal construction site." I saw an opportunity I just couldn't pass up. "Don't tell her who I am, Gideon," I said. "Just play it straight and do your job by the book. I want to see exactly how far she's willing to take this." Sometimes, the best way to deal with people like Ramona is to give them exactly what they ask for. Roughly 20 minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of a patrol car crunching up my gravel driveway. Gideon stepped out in full uniform, doing his best to appear serious and professional despite the ridiculous circumstances. "Afternoon, sir," he called out, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I've received a complaint regarding unauthorized construction activity on this property. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I played along, putting on the tone of a law-abiding citizen who didn't want any trouble. "Of course, officer, I definitely don't want any problems. Is there an issue with my pool construction?" I could see the corners of Gideon's mouth twitching as he struggled not to smile. And right on cue, Ramona made her grand return. She'd apparently gone home to clean up and change outfits and had even upgraded her gear. Now she carried what looked like a semi-professional camera setup and had the determined look of someone who believed she was starring in her own documentary. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she said, striding toward us with renewed confidence. "This man has been completely uncooperative and hostile. He's engaged in illegal construction that's threatening the safety and property values of our entire community." Gideon nodded solemnly and pulled out his notepad, falling into character as the dutiful officer handling a high-stakes complaint. "Ma'am, I'll need to gather statements and examine all documentation before making any determinations." Then he turned to me. "Sir, do you have permits for this project?" I nodded and handed him a neatly organized folder. "Yes, officer, all the permits are in order." Everything was approved by the county before we began. Just then, in her attempt to capture another cinematic angle, Ramona started backing up while narrating for her camera. You'd think she'd have learned her lesson after the mud incident, but apparently, she hadn't. As she stepped back, she didn't notice the large pile of horse manure left behind by my animals during their morning graze. "This is precisely why strong community standards matter," she proclaimed just as her shoes landed squarely in it. She lost her balance and went down hard, turning her video from crusade to slapstick comedy in seconds. Gideon had to turn away and pretend to cough just to keep from bursting out laughing. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, managing to sound genuinely concerned as he offered her a hand. After reviewing the paperwork and confirming everything was fully legal and properly permitted, Gideon gave his verdict. "Sir, your documentation is in perfect order. This is private property, and the construction meets all county regulations. I see no violations here." Ramona stood there, stunned, her jaw dropped in disbelief, as if the idea of a legal construction project on land she didn't control was simply beyond comprehension. "That can't be right," There have to be violations. What about community standards? What about the environmental impact? Gideon shook his head politely. Ma'am, those concerns fall under civil matters between private parties. They don't fall within the jurisdiction of law enforcement. But she still wasn't ready to back down, with horse manure clinging to her clothes and what I assumed was a rapidly growing online audience. She pulled out what she thought was her trump card. Fine, if you won't do your job properly, then I demand to speak to the sheriff. I want the highest authority in this county to see what's going on. I couldn't help but smile at that one. She was so determined to escalate things. She was literally asking to speak to the man standing in front of her. I'd be very interested to meet the sheriff myself, I said. I'm sure he'd have some strong opinions about this situation. Gideon was biting his lip so hard, I was worried he might draw blood. I'll make arrangements for you to speak with the sheriff personally, ma'am, he said, barely holding back his amusement. You'll have his full attention. The next morning, my quiet valley became the center stage for Ramona's next act. Apparently, she'd spent the night building momentum online. By sunrise, she had launched what she called a community action group. Her video from the day before, complete with her dramatic fire, had gained over 1,200 views overnight. Though I suspect most people weren't watching to support her cause, they were in it for the laughs. Still, you had to admire her persistence. Not many people would double down after becoming a walking internet meme, but Ramona clearly wasn't most people. She was determined to turn this into a campaign. Her first move, launching a petition titled "Stop Pool Vandalism in Dry Needle Basin," filled with dramatic photos of my construction site taken with a telephoto lens from the road, no less. According to the petition, my pool was an environmental crisis and a cultural catastrophe all rolled into one. She printed 200 copies and began going door to door through the whole neighborhood, clipboard in hand and righteous fury in her eyes. Her approach wasn't exactly neighborly, it was more like an aggressive door-to-door salesman who refuses to take no for an answer. Reactions varied. Some people signed the petition just to get rid of her. Others closed their doors without a word. And then there were those who knew the Lindell-Namia, who understood what this land meant and wanted no part of her crusade. One particular moment stood out. I watched from my truck as Ramona knocked on the door of a modest home belonging to Miss Patterson, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in the valley for decades. As soon as the door opened, Ramona launched into her usual speech about property values and community integrity. But Miss Patterson cut her off. "Young lady," Miss Patterson's voice rang out across the yard, steady and firm, "the Lindell family has been good to this community since long before you were born. If Bo wants to build a pool on his own land, that's his business." But what happened next was more revealing than dramatic. Ramona's reaction, instead of her usual bluster, hinted at something deeper, maybe even doubt. "But ma'am," she said, trying to maintain her composure, "you don't understand the long-term impact this could have on property values and the aesthetic of our community." Miss Patterson just gave her a knowing smile and shook her head. "Honey, that family owns this entire valley. They've been taking care of it since the 1920s. I think they know what they're doing." That's when I saw something flicker behind Ramona's carefully composed expression, a brief moment of confusion, and for the first time, the possibility that she might not fully understand the situation she was trying to control. "They own the whole valley?" she asked, blinking as if the scale of it hadn't registered until now. But Miss Patterson had already begun to close her door, her words final, like the end of a conversation that didn't need to be continued. As soon as Ramona got home, she must have gone straight to her computer and started researching the Lindell family and our history in Dry Needle Basin. I could only imagine what she discovered: archived newspaper clippings about my great-grandfather's homesteading days, county records showing our land acquisitions over the decades, and stories about our long-standing community involvement. What she probably didn't find, though, was any mention of my current role as county sheriff. I've always preferred my jeans and boots to a badged uniform, and I make a point of keeping a low profile when I'm off duty. Still, something had shifted in her. For the first time, I saw cracks in her unwavering confidence. A few days later, Ramona set up a petition booth at the local farmers market. But her message didn't exactly resonate. Most people at the market were longtime locals who had grown up around our ranch. Many of them had swum in our pond as kids or attended holiday gatherings we hosted over the years. When the neighborhood children started running over to greet me, calling out Uncle Bo, like I was family, Ramona's strained smile told me she was beginning to understand just how misaligned her assumptions were. "Do you know Uncle Bo?" one little girl asked her with bright curiosity. "He lets us pet his horses." Ramona's expression froze, caught somewhere between a grimace and a forced grin as she tried to hold on to her activist persona, now unraveling in the face of warm community recognition. Then, as if to punctuate her discomfort, nature decided to have a little fun of its own. A sudden gust of wind swept through the market, scattering her petition papers like confetti. Ramona dashed after them, trying to gather the pages as children giggled and joined in the chase. Behind her, her pop-up tent collapsed into a heap. By the time she'd collected her crumpled paperwork, her once polished setup looked like it had survived a small tornado. Standing amid muddy documents and a broken tent, it was clear Ramona was starting to question whether this was the hill she really wanted to die on. But she didn't give up. Instead, she doubled down at transforming herself into what she clearly believed was a legal authority. Armed with nothing but internet searches and sheer determination, she printed over 40 pages of building codes, zoning laws, and permit guidelines she'd found online. The problem? Most of the materials she printed had nothing to do with rural ranch properties. They were geared toward commercial developments, dense residential zones, or properties within city limits. None of it applied to my pool or my land. But that didn't stop her. Convinced she had finally found the loophole that would end my project, Ramona drafted what she believed was a professional cease and desist letter. It was packed with legal jargon copied and pasted from various websites and written in a tone that suggested she believed she had the full authority of the law on her side. It was a remarkable example of someone armed with just enough knowledge to be dangerously wrong. The letter was full of stern warnings, threats of penalties, and confident declarations. What it lacked was any actual relevance. Still, I had to admire the effort. When she returned to my property for round 2 of our ongoing battle, she came armed like she was preparing for trial. Her BMW was stuffed with printed documents, file folders, and a table ready to record what she must have thought would be my surrender. I was by the pasture, watching the horses graze in the soft morning sun, when I heard her car struggling once again up the dirt road. But something felt different this time. The confident swagger was still there, but now it was laced with frustration and maybe a touch of desperation. She was beginning to realize that the usual HOA tactics weren't going to work out here. And when people get desperate, they tend to act unpredictably. "I've done my research," she called out before even reaching me, waving a thick folder like a weapon. "You're violating building codes, and I have the proof right here." I set down the water bucket I'd been carrying and turned to face her calmly, honestly a little curious now. "Well, that sounds serious," I said. "Where exactly did you find this information?" Her face lit up with a flash of pride. She pulled out her stack of paperwork like a student presenting a perfect project. Ramona launched into an elaborate explanation of her findings, quoting code sections, referencing legal articles, and reciting jargon with the confidence of someone who'd spent one too many late nights on legal forums. According to her, my pool violated multiple building ordinances and would need to be halted immediately. I listened patiently as she read aloud from her stack of notes. She cited municipal building codes intended for commercial buildings. She quoted city regulations set to a man building a backyard pool on unincorporated ranch land. When she finally finished her monologue, I asked to see the papers myself. They were, admittedly, well organized. She'd clearly put in the work. But after just a few moments of reading, the flaws became glaringly obvious. "Ma'am," I said, handing the stack back to her with a respectful tone, "I appreciate the time and effort you've put into this, but all of these regulations you're referencing apply to urban and commercial properties within city limits. This here is a private ranch in unincorporated county land. None of these codes apply." She stared at me, blinking, her confident Section 8 beginning to falter. The idea that different jurisdictions followed different sets of rules had clearly never crossed Ramona's mind. Laws are laws, she insisted, though her voice had lost much of the conviction it once carried. You can't just ignore building codes because you live in the country. That's when I finally asked the question that had been on my mind since our first encounter, and from the look on her face, it was beginning to gnaw at her too. Ramona, I'm genuinely curious, what exactly gives the HOA the authority to regulate construction on land that lies outside of the subdivision? She blinked several times, visibly scrambling for an answer that didn't exist. The HOA has clear oversight for maintaining community standards throughout the entire region, she said at last, but even as the words left her mouth, her confidence wavered. It was the first time I'd heard real uncertainty creep into her voice, and I realized she might finally be starting to question the assumption she'd clung to so tightly. Just then, my horse Thunderbolt wandered over, curious about the unusual energy in the air. Horses are naturally inquisitive creatures, and Thunderbolt seemed particularly intrigued by the stack of papers Ramona was clutching. Before either of us could react, he clamped his teeth around the edge of her folder and began chewing like he'd found the day's most exciting snack. No, stop that, Ramona cried, tugging at the paperwork as Thunderbolt calmly shredded hours of her research. Papers flew to the ground, some torn, others punctured with unmistakable horse bite marks. Scrambling to her feet, dirt smudged on her knees and half her documents now in ruins, she pulled out what she clearly thought was her last and best weapon. Fine, if you won't listen to reason, I'm calling the sheriff's office directly, she snapped. I'll have someone sent out here who actually understands the law. I had to suppress a grin. She was so determined to escalate the situation that she was so without realizing it threatening me with me. That's a great idea, Ramona, I said calmly. I've been meaning to have a conversation with the sheriff myself. Her confidence snapped right back into place, as if she'd remembered she was holding a trump card. Good, because once the sheriff sees what you're doing, this entire operation is going to be shut down. The next morning began like any other, with me enjoying a cup of coffee while the sunrise bathed the mountains in gold and pink. Meanwhile, Ramona was apparently dialing the sheriff's office, her voice thick with self-righteous urgency. This is an emergency, she told the dispatcher. I need the sheriff to respond immediately to a serious violation of building codes and community safety. Our dispatcher, ever the professional, assured her that the sheriff would personally respond within 30 minutes. What she didn't know or what made this moment so utterly perfect was that she had just arranged the most ironically satisfying law enforcement response in Dry Needle County history. When the call reached me, I couldn't help but laugh. After days of threats, demands, and declarations that the sheriff would handle this, she was finally going to get her wish. And I was finally going to give her what she'd been asking for. I headed to my closet and pulled out my full uniform for the first time since this whole mess began. The badge, the boots, the hat. Sometimes, the best way to bring clarity to chaos is to give someone exactly what they think they want, only not quite in the way they expected. Driving to my own ranch in the county patrol vehicle was surreal. There I was, responding to a formal complaint about myself. Gideon had offered to ride along, but I told him this was something I needed to handle on my own. As I turned onto the dirt road, it was clear Ramona had gone all in. She'd set up multiple camera angles around the construction site, likely hoping to film her moment of triumph. Her online followers were probably expecting to witness the grand climax of her campaign, the day justice was served and the villain was brought down. When I arrived, it was clear she'd invited an audience. About a dozen HOA members were standing around the site, no doubt expecting to see me arrested or publicly reprimanded. Ramona was dressed in what must have been her most professional outfit, clutching a brand new folder of documents to replace the ones Thunderbolt had destroyed. She was practically glowing with anticipation as she saw the official sheriff's vehicle approach, probably rehearsing her victory speech in her head. The moment I stepped out of the car in full uniform was absolutely unforgettable. There was an audible gasp from the crowd, loud enough to carry across the entire clearing. But it was Ramona's face that made the scene truly priceless. Her expression went from confident excitement to stunned confusion to dawning horror, all within seconds. Her camera, carefully positioned to capture the sheriff reprimanding the troublemaker, instead recorded her mouth falling open and her folder slipping from limp fingers. It was like watching someone's entire narrative unravel in real time. "Good afternoon, folks," I said, my voice steady and professional as I tipped my hat. "I'm Sheriff Lindell. I understand someone here requested my presence regarding a legal matter." Silence, the kind of silence you can feel. Ramona stood there, staring at me as if I were a ghost. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no sound coming out. Her audience, realizing what was actually happening, slowly turned to look at her. The entire crowd was beginning to understand that this wasn't the dramatic takedown she had promised Thema. It was something else entirely. You could practically hear the mental gears grinding as they tried to reconcile what they were seeing. It took Ramona nearly a full minute to find her voice again. And when she did, it came out soft, fragilely. Ramona's voice came out as a barely audible whisper. But you can't be." I gave her a polite nod. "I'm Sheriff Bolindell, ma'am. I've held this position for the past 8 years. Before that, I served as a deputy for 6 years under the previous sheriff. Now, I understand you had some concerns regarding a law enforcement matter you'd like to discuss." Behind me, I heard a few murmurs ripple through the gathered neighbors as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Someone in the crowd even let out a laugh, though they tried to disguise it with a cough. "This is impossible," Ramona finally managed to say, her voice rising with each word. "You can't investigate yourself. This is a conflict of interest. You're supposed to be impartial." I calmly pulled out my notepad, just as I would for any official call. "Ma'am, let's start with the basics. What exactly would you like to report? What crime do you believe has been committed here?" She stood frozen, blinking at me like someone whose entire worldview had just crashed. It was like watching a person reboot in real time, struggling to reconcile the story they'd written in their head with the reality unfolding in front of them. One of the older gentlemen in the crowd chuckled quietly, then another joined in. Within seconds, half the group was stifling laughter. Ramona's grand moment of vindication had turned into an unforgettable public flop, and her camera was recording every second of it. "Yeah, this isn't how it was supposed to go," she muttered, her gaze darting around at the now amused faces of her audience, clearly hoping someone would step in and restore order to her unraveling narrative. "Ma'am," I said gently, "I'm here, as requested, to investigate your complaint. You mentioned building code violations and threats to community safety. Could you tell me, specifically, what crime you believe has taken place?" Her eyes dropped to her disheveled documents, then flicked up to my badge, then over to the crowd who were now clearly not taking her seriously. For the first time since our paths had crossed, Ramona had no words. Some comebacks don't require you to say anything at all. Sometimes silence does the heavy lifting. After an agonizing pause, she finally managed to speak, though her voice trembled. "This is a clear conflict of interest. You can't investigate yourself. There have to be laws against this." I nodded as if considering her argument carefully. "You are absolutely right, ma'am. I can't investigate myself. But first, you'll need to clarify what law you believe I've broken." That shut her down. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, then opened it once more. Like a fish gasping for air, she floundered to find footing for her accusations. "Building violations," she finally blurted. "Unauthorized construction, environmental damage, community standards violations." I reached into the patrol car and retrieved the same folder of permits and approvals that Gideon had reviewed earlier. "Could you please point out which specific regulation I violated?" "These are all the proper county permits for swimming pool construction on private land in unincorporated territory." I spread the documents across the hood of the patrol vehicle. Several neighbors stepped closer, curiosity drawing them in as their amusement began to shift into genuine interest. It was the perfect moment to offer a little education, and not just for Ramona, but for everyone gathered around. "Folks, since we're all here, let me clear up some confusion. This ranch sits entirely on private land owned by my family since 1923. It lies well outside any homeowners association boundaries, and it's not within any municipal limits." I pulled out a county survey map and unrolled it next to the permits. "The HOA subdivision ends about a half-mile down that road. Beyond that, they have no authority in any over construction, land use, or anything else that happens on this ranch. The crowd leaned in. I could see eyes scanning the map, light bulbs going off. One woman, who lived on the edge of the subdivision, finally spoke up. The broken bar, so the HOA doesn't have any say over anything outside their own development? I nodded. Exactly. HOAs only have jurisdiction over properties within their mapped boundaries and only for residents who have signed agreements to abide by their rules. This concept seemed to genuinely shock some people, like it had never even occurred to them that HOA authority might have limits. Meanwhile, Ramona was flipping frantically through her paperwork, trying to salvage her position, but coming up empty. "But what about community standards?" she cried. "What about property values? Environmental concerns?" I gestured to the sweeping valley around us. "Ma'am, my family has cared for this land for over 100 years. We've preserved it, protected it, and shared it with neighbors, with emergency services, with the community at large. Our stewardship goes far beyond buzzwords on HOA flyers." Just then, a voice from the crowd dropped a revelation even I hadn't expected. "Ramona," someone said plainly, "didn't you know that a bunch of homes in our subdivision are built on land leased from the Lindell family?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the group. People looked at each other, murmuring, realizing they might not have understood their own property situations as well as they'd thought. Ramona's face drained of color. That's not true," she insisted, but the uncertainty in her voice gave her away. "We own our homes outright." I gave her a solemn nod, letting the weight of it settle in. She was beginning to realize that the story she'd built where she was the defender of community order was built on foundations far more fragile than she knew. I nodded, confirming what the neighbor had said. "Actually, that's partially correct. When the subdivision was first developed about 15 years ago, my father leased several parcels to the developer. The original boundaries of our ranch included some ideal spots for residential lots. Homeowners owned their houses and the immediate land surrounding them, but about a third of the subdivision still sits on land leased from the Lindell family." You could almost see the shock ripple through the crowd. People glanced at one another, the implications starting to settle in. Ramona, on the other hand, looked like she might be sick. "There's nothing quite like realizing you've been trying to push around your own landlord." "So let me get this straight," one neighbor said, an older man whose home, as it turned out, was built on one of those leased parcels. "You're saying Ramona has been telling the landowner what he can and can't do on his own property?" The absurdity of the situation was becoming too obvious to ignore except for Ramona, who was still frantically searching for some foothold, some rule, some technicality that might justify her crusade. "There have to be regulations," she insisted, "oversight committees, permitting boards. You can't just do whatever you want." But her voice was losing strength, like someone finally realizing they'd picked a fight with the wrong persona and no longer had a crowd to back them up. The neighbors around her were shaking their heads. Some were muttering about being misled, and that online video she had so confidently set up to document her victory, it was now broadcasting her collapse to anyone unfortunate or amused enough to be watching. There's a unique sadness in watching someone's grand moment implode in front of them, especially when it's entirely self-inflicted. In one final attempt to seize control, Ramona pulled out her phone like it was a sword. "I'm calling the state police. I'm reporting corruption, abuse of power." This time, several people actually laughed out loud. I kept a straight face, but inside, I was thoroughly enjoying the moment. "You're absolutely entitled to contact any agency you wish," I said calmly, "but for the record, no crime has been committed here, no law broken, and certainly no abuse of power. I'm simply building a swimming pool on my own land with all the proper permits." Sometimes, the simplest truths carry the most weight. And then came the final blow. One of the HOA board members who had come to observe but remained silent up to this point stepped forward and said, "Ramona, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your leadership of Broken Bar and whether you've been representing facts accurately to the homeowners." Heads nodded all around. I could tell right then that Ramona's reign as HOA president was over. Standing there, surrounded by neighbors who had once supported her, with a recording still running that captured every second of her public downfall, Ramona realized she hadn't just lost a battle over a swimming pool, she had lost her credibility, her authority, and her place in the community she tried so hard to control. The fallout came swiftly. Within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The vote to remove her as president was unanimous, 7-0. Ramona, notably, was not present. She'd locked herself in her home, too embarrassed to face the very people she tried to rally. A kind and reasonable woman named Mrs. Kim was elected interim president. She was tasked with repairing the HOA's reputation and creating fair, transparent guidelines that respected both the community and individual property rights. In one final act of desperation, Ramona did indeed contact the state police, claiming corruption in the sheriff's department. A state trooper called her back a professional, but directed and explained that county sheriffs have full jurisdiction over their counties, and that building a permitted swimming pool on private land did not, under any definition, qualify as abuse of power. She tried to escalate further, but was politely advised that the matter was closed and, if she still felt aggrieved, she could pursue civil options. But sometimes, when you've dug a deep hole, the best thing to do is stop digging. The response from the community was exactly what you'd expect in a small town. There was embarrassment, of course, but also relief. The drama was finally over. A few neighbors approached me in the days that followed, apologizing for signing Ramona's petition. They admitted they'd felt pressured and hadn't known the full story. I assured them there were no hard feelings. Misunderstandings happen, especially in close-knit communities. The important thing was that it had all been resolved peacefully. And, truth be told, I hadn't had that much entertainment in years. But the real surprise came a few days later, when Mrs. Kim called me with a proposal. "Sheriff Lindell," she said, "the HOA board was wondering a broken bar once your pool is finished. Would you be willing to host a community barbecue? We think it would be a great way to bring everyone back together and show that there are no hard feelings about everything that happened." I thought the barbecue was a wonderful idea, and planning began almost immediately. What followed turned into the biggest community gathering Dry Needle Basin had seen in years. Nothing unites people quite like good food and the chance to laugh at the chaos they somehow all lived through together. Word of the event spread quickly through both the HOA subdivision and the broader valley. People were eager to see the now famous swimming pool that had sparked so much drama, and even more excited to meet their neighbors in a setting that didn't involve petitions, arguments, or HOA ultimatums. Local businesses chipped in, donating food and supplies. Volunteers came forward to help with setup, cooking, and coordination. It was shaping up to be exactly what the community needed: a fresh start. About 2 weeks later, construction on the pool was finally complete and it exceeded every expectation. The water was sparkling, the landscaping was lush and perfectly manicured, and the view from the pool deck across the valley was breathtaking. My kids were thrilled, and my wife was already dreaming up summer parties and family get-togethers. But first, we had a party to throw for the entire town. The day of the barbecue couldn't have been more perfect. The skies were clear, the temperature was just right, and a soft breeze carried the scent of pine trees and grilled meat across the hills. People began arriving around noon, arms full of side dishes and folding chairs. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. Neighbors who'd barely exchanged greetings before were now laughing, telling stories, and discovering shared interests. Kids ran wild with joy, and adults sipped cold drinks in the Montana sunshine. It was the kind of day that reminds you why small towns matter: when people show up, listen to each other, and choose connection over conflict. Gideon showed up in his off-duty clothes, and I took the opportunity to make a long-overdue announcement. "Folks," I said, "I want to take a moment to recognize Deputy Gideon Tate, who's been doing outstanding work for our county over the past 4 years. I'm pleased to announce that he's officially been promoted to senior deputy." The crowd erupted in applause. It felt good to celebrate something positive after all the tension we'd worked through. Later in the afternoon, someone asked the question that was quietly on everyone's mind: "So broken bar, whatever happened to Ramona?" One of the HOA residents asked. Mrs. Kim, always diplomatic, replied smoothly, "She's decided to relocate to a community that might be more aligned with her lifestyle preferences." Her house went on the market last week. There were a few quiet nods, and a shared sense that this outcome was probably best for everyone, Ramona included. The highlight of the day came when we officially opened the pool. About a dozen kids lined up and, at the count of 3, cannonballed in at once, sending a wave of water over half the adults nearby. Everyone burst into laughter. The pool quickly filled with kids splashing, playing, and screaming with joy. It was everything I had hoped for when I first imagined building it. As the sun dipped behind the mountains and guests began packing up, I looked around and reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. What had started as a simple home improvement project had snowballed into full-blown neighborhood chaos and somehow resolved into something better than I could have imagined. A stronger, more connected community. Sometimes the best outcomes grow from the most unexpected challenges. Sometimes you need a little storm to clear the air. 3 months later, I was sitting by the pool, sipping my morning coffee and watching the sun rise as it painted the mountains in gold and pink. Peaceful, quiet, exactly what I'd hoped for when this all began. That's when Gideon's patrol car rolled up the drive. "Morning, boss," he called as he walked over. "Got a new complaint for you." I sighed and set my coffee down, bracing myself. "Please tell me it's not another HOA situation." He grinned. "Nope, this one's different. Mrs. Patterson called. Says you've been swimming too quietly in the mornings." I blinked. "Too quietly?" "Yeah," he said with a chuckle. "Her grandkids like listening to the splashing sounds when they visit. Apparently, you're not making enough noise for their entertainment." I burst out laughing, stood up from my chair, and said, "Well, we can't have disappointed grandchildren, can we?" Then I took a running leap and cannonballed into the pool with the biggest splash I could manage. Sometimes being sheriff means serving your community in ways you never expect, but I've got to admit, this was easily the most enjoyable complaint I've ever received. We're Ya Storyessa, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Stick around for the next one. We promise, it's even wilder.